When people think of China's footprint in Africa, they usually picture railways, power stations, and billion-dollar infrastructure. But perhaps the bigger story today isn't what China is building. It's the lives being built there. South Africa has long been one of China's most important partners on the continent. And what happens there may offer a glimpse of where the Asian superpower's relationship with Africa is headed next. Now, take Liu Nanfei. Her parents named her after the country that changed their lives. Listen to this.
When post-apartheid happened in 1994, they saw that there was a great opportunity for them to select South Africa as their country of choice. And to honor sort of that confidence, they also named me after South Africa. So my name is Nanfei, which in Chinese, it translates directly to South Africa.
I'm Genevieve and I'm joined by our senior correspondent, Olivia Siong, who will tell us about China's next chapter in Africa. And Olivia, you traveled across South Africa, from Northern Cape to Limpopo, Johannesburg, and Cape Town. Wow, from one continent to another grand continent. What inspired you to do this?
Jen, I want to bring you back first to 2024. As China correspondents, we are very used to having these big diplomatic events in Beijing. But in 2024, there was one particular event that felt different, and that being the Forum for Cooperation between China and Africa. Everyone remembers the flower displays and the grand speeches by the Chinese president at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. But what I remember most vividly was the bad traffic in the city. And Beijing came to a standstill so many times in the day because President Xi was meeting every single African leader who had traveled to China individually. And that's 36, I believe, African heads of state or government. And that was really one of the largest gatherings of foreign heads of states in China since the country emerged out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that made me really realize that this wasn't just another summit or big event. Africa had really become a much bigger priority for Beijing. And that also came at a time where I was noticing and interacting with many more students, diplomats, business people, entrepreneurs from Africa in China. And so that sparked the idea and made me very curious. I thought about reversing the journey, so to speak, and instead of asking only, what the African interests were in Beijing, I also wanted to see what the Chinese interests were in Africa itself.
Yeah, speaking of, when you call reverse engineering, right? We earlier we heard Liu Nanfei, right? Her name, Nanfei, it's so remarkable for a Chinese lady, right? No, when you came across that story, did you realize that you're looking at a very different relationship now between China and Africa from the one that, we're kind of used to, those images of, like you said, Belt and Road infrastructure?
Yeah, I think this was probably the interview that stayed with me the most because when I was first introduced to her, I was told that, yes, this is Fei. So it wasn't until we actually got started chatting that she told me her full name was Nanfei. And in that moment, I paused and it just all clicked for me because her whole life story sort of made sense. Suddenly, she wasn't just another interviewee, but she really sort of came to embody this China-South Africa relationship across generations. Her parents arrived in South Africa in the mid-1990s, post-apartheid, looking for opportunity. And another very interesting part of the family story is that they are from Guizhou province, which is an inland region in southwestern China. It's not typically a sending province where Chinese people have migrated from. We are familiar with many going from the coastal regions like Guangdong or Fujian. But Nanfei, actually, she had been in South Africa. They moved when she was just 1 year old and she grew up there. And then after that, she studied and worked in the US. But the other interesting part of it was that she chose to come back to South Africa from the US. And that really wasn't the direction I expected the story to go, because one line that really stuck with me that she said was that, if you made it in America, why would you come back? And now she's seeing more and more of her peers, also Chinese living in South Africa, doing that. And it made me also realize that this wasn't just about Chinese companies going overseas. It was also about where younger Chinese see their future. And while I had expected to meet many people who had left China for South Africa, I didn't really expect to meet someone who had left South Africa for the US and then, voluntarily chosen to come back. And that really changed how I thought about this entire story.
Yeah, and that's interesting. That's almost like in a nutshell, right? That summed up, I suppose, the evolution of this relationship, right? China's story in Africa seems to, it's evolving, and it's through stories like her, right? First, it was the traders, like you said, and then now there's also then the big state-backed infrastructure projects, which is the one that, like we said, we're always used to, and then companies are assembling machinery locally, creating jobs and manufacturing. Now, do you think China's strategy has fundamentally changed, or is it adapting to new economic realities?
Yeah, when I first started on this project and researching it, I thought, maybe we'll be telling much more of a Belt and Road story. We are familiar with that, we see it in the headlines. But as I dug into it a bit deeper, it became very clear that the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a signature Chinese infrastructure initiative, was only just one chapter of a much bigger story. And infrastructure is still happening. We were at the Redstone concentrated solar power plant in South Africa's Northern Cape, and that really is a good example of that. It was really spectacular with 40,000 mirrors reflecting the sun's rays onto this tower. It kind of felt like, Lord of the Rings, the Eye of Mordor, generating electricity.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you said that, because I was at the mother plant that actually inspired, or actually Redstone was modeled on. I was at the Dunhuang molten salt thermal plant that was constructed in 2015, and it was massive when it was first opened. And the Redstone plant that you were at was modeled on that exact engineering blueprint. And like you said, it was amazing, right? Being there on that landscape. I felt like I landed in outer space with the mirrors, the vast desert just leveled by, you just seem to be lost in time and sand.
Yeah,
Wasn't
exactly.
it?
It's quite hard to explain it, but on the ground, me and the cameraman, we actually were like, oh my gosh, we are having difficulty opening our eyes because it's just reflecting the sun. And we actually had to take breaks in between filming because it was just so hot. It was so sunny.
Right.
But, alongside those mega projects, there were other things that were emerging as well. So it's interesting, this connection.
Yes. And to flip it from you, I filmed towards dusk. So it was much cooler. I went there in October in the Gobi Desert, so it was much cooler. So unlike yours, I was in my puffy jacket, whereas you, I think you were in t-shirt and shorts, I think, for the heat. But yes,
I wish I was in t-shirt and shorts. But that would have been perhaps more appropriate than that.
So that was, I guess that's the connection. It shows, how the Chinese engineers had transplanted such technology all the way from one desert to another.
Yeah, but alongside these mega projects, there were other things that were interesting. And that's also reflected in the kind of language that we're seeing coming out of Beijing. Now we're hearing much more. Even President Xi himself has talked about, quote, small and beautiful projects. These refer to projects that are more commercially sustainable, less risky, especially trying to get smaller private enterprises on board, rather than just building bigger and bigger projects, though they look spectacular. Well, let me give you a statistic. According to a report by Boston University, we actually saw China's landing to Africa fall by nearly half to $2.1 billion in 2024, and that's compared with the previous year. And this is the first decline since the COVID-19 pandemic, when we had seen actually the peak being in 2012 and 2018 when the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. More than $10 billion. That was the figure we were looking at every year. But we have seen China become concerned about risky debt in African countries. You know, we've heard of Zambia, Ghana, Ethiopia being pushed into default after the pandemic. So overall, we've also seen this shift in the approach when it comes to Chinese investment or loans into the African continent. And increasingly also another trend that we're seeing is, Chinese companies, they don't just go there to build or import goods, but they're manufacturing locally as well, hiring locally, building businesses, as one Chinese company told me, putting down roots in South Africa.
Right. And that's definitely, the story is moving, right? Definitely from made in China, transporting, transplanting, just technology or hardware, to made by Chinese companies in Africa, isn't it? What do you think is driving this shift?
In China, there's this term that you hear constantly. It's 出海, which is a term referring to Chinese enterprises going overseas. And this is no longer just a buzzword or something catchy. It's not even just a side strategy for many Chinese companies, but it's become a big core part of Chinese company strategy for growth. And there are push and pull factors, right? So the push factors, partly because of what's happening within China. We know there's a slowing property market, weaker construction activity, weak domestic consumption. Of course, we hear a lot about the trade tensions. So I also heard from those in charge of Johannesburg's Chinatown, they said that they are receiving many more delegations from the local governments bringing businesses to South Africa to explore opportunities. And so those there have been involved in explaining to them the rules and regulations and introducing them to the relevant government departments so that they can invest and find opportunities in South Africa. But there's also the pull factor. In the whole world, why would you choose to go to the African continent or to South Africa specifically? And I spoke to Darren Davids, who is an analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit in Johannesburg, and he said that South Africa is often seen as this launch pad into the African market because it already has infrastructure and capacity. So it's a lower infrastructure investment for many companies than entering via other African countries. South Africa is also seeking to grow its economy, also create more jobs because its overall youth unemployment rate stands at more than 45% in the first quarter of this year. So, for instance, I visited Sani. I think you may be familiar with this heavy equipment manufacturer, excavators and drills and things like that. They have just opened a new facility to manufacture all this equipment locally. And here's what Sani's Southern Africa Regional Service Director Leon Liu told me.
In the early days, we mainly focused on trade. We manufactured our equipment in China and brought it to South Africa. Now our goal is to assemble and manufacture locally. This factory has been designed to assemble up to 1,000 machines a year, creating local jobs in the process. Shipping fully assembled machines carries risks because they can be damaged during loading. Another point is that transporting it on a ro-ro, roll-on, roll-off vessel is relatively expensive. If we disassemble it and ship the parts in containers first, the components will be well protected inside the containers and won't be damaged, so there won't be any additional repair or replacement costs. Second, we can also save a portion of the shipping costs.
So the other factor here is that there has been some unhappiness within South Africa among some industries over the impact of Chinese imports. That's not to say that there aren't any benefits in the shift in approach for China for these Chinese companies to invest more, to put manufacturing within South Africa. But there are also incentives by the government for Chinese firms to invest. Last year, South Africa announced a 1 billion rand or roughly $60 million incentive program to support the local production of electric vehicles and batteries. And that's also because we've seen Chinese automakers really aggressively expand their share of the South African passenger car market, and that is affecting local industries. So analysts are saying that yes, there were some local industries who are pushing for more tariffs because their business is being affected. But what the South African government has been keen to do is to encourage greater investment and then also through that create jobs and stimulate growth.
Right. Now, Liv, you spent wow, almost 2 weeks, right? Traveling across South
A lot of
Africa.
time on the road. It's huge.
Yes, I saw that a lot of,
Yeah.
the road trip, huge road trip. Was there anything that didn't make it into the documentary? I'm sure you had hours and hours of footage.
Yeah, it's really tough, trimming it down. I'm sure you understand, Jen.
Yeah.
It's the hardest part of producing any
Yes, because
story.
everything you film is good, right? Everything that we
Yeah.
cut is gold. It's like, oh, how are we gonna choose? I can't choose my favorite child. Every scene is good.
I know it's tough, but I'm glad I get to talk about it now because there were so many little moments that never made it into the documentary. For one, I really did not expect to be speaking so much Chinese in South Africa. And there were some conversations I had with traders at what locals call China malls, and these are big centers selling lots of imported Chinese goods. And I I couldn't find anyone of these business owners who would agree to speaking to me on camera. But when I spoke to them off camera, they were very candid about why they were in South Africa. They talked about challenges within China, challenges in finding a job, which led them to leave for greater, in search of other opportunities. And another memorable moment for me was also at Redstone, that solar plant. The site is so remote that the Redstone staff actually offered for our team to stay the night in the Northern Cape because, it's just so remote and it takes time to travel there. We were filming the whole day, but our filming schedule didn't allow it. But what was really interesting was that the workers live in these converted container accommodation, and between filming, we all sat down and actually had hot pot together.
Wow. It's very typically Chinese and typical Chinese hospitality almost.
Yeah, they really wanted to feed us, but I just did not expect, hot pot in the Northern Cape.
Right.
Yeah, and the conversations we had were about, how they are adjusting to life in a totally different environment. They talked about, making trips to bigger cities like Johannesburg when they had time so that they could stock up on, comfort food for them.
Yes.
I also spoke to the deputy director of the SEPCO 3 South Africa Redstone plant, and he was telling me he worked for years also, not just in South Africa. He has also worked in Saudi Arabia before on similar engineering construction projects. And it really made me realize again that these engineers were not just building projects, but this has become a career overseas and their way of life. Have a listen.
At the beginning, I did not think that much about it, but gradually I got used to the work. In Saudi Arabia, the summers are extremely hot. Given the amount of work we do on site every day, everyone has to endure those harsh conditions. Here in South Africa, the temperature overall, including winter, is very comfortable.
All right, then. When I saw your filming and your reporting in Johannesburg, it's like, wow, that's, I wish I was there, 20
You should
years
come
ago,
next time.
Yeah, let's go. We should go to visit both the thermal plants together, the solar thermal plants.
Yeah.
Now, 20 years ago, the image of the Chinese community was family-run shops and, China malls. Today, you met renewable energy entrepreneurs, consultants, and second-generation Chinese South Africans. How has the Chinese community itself changed?
What struck me really from my time there was that the community still relies very heavily on relationships. Almost every trader that I met told me that it was someone in their family or from their province that had introduced them to the South African market. And many of these, especially the small businesses, they are family run, and there are provincial associations there from Guizhou to Fujian and others that continue to support newcomers. What also struck me was that the courage that many of them had in search of opportunity, some leaving family, children behind. Like I spoke to this lady, Chen Xiuzhu, who runs a small supermarket in Chinatown. She has 2 children who live in China still, and she made her first pot of gold in South Africa, went back home to China, built a house, and then returned back to South Africa. And she said she went to South Africa because her husband was already working there, and she didn't know anything about the country, couldn't speak the local language. She could speak a bit of English, but she continued to press on there. But at the same time, she was telling me that the profile of the community has changed. Chinatown, she says, is quieter than before because the Chinese community, in the past, they would congregate there, but now they are more spread out, especially across Johannesburg, because they're no longer all doing the same or similar types of work. Some run trading businesses, but like you said, others are consultants or run bigger companies, or they are from state-owned companies or bigger Chinese companies. You have your Huawei, BYD, so many big Chinese companies setting up shop in South Africa. So another interesting part was that entrepreneurs are also now realizing that there is an importance and a need to build this bridge between China and South Africa and between companies. And here is Liu Nanfei again. She actually runs her own consultancy firm, and she's director of ConvergeX Solutions. And have a listen as to how she would describe what she does for a living now.
My parents, they built their business on what you could perhaps just call hard skills, right? Where I'm building my business on soft power, and that's relationship and understanding culture.
So, Liv, after this reporting trip, what surprised you most? Was there a moment that you realized that the story you thought you'd started on had, taken on, turned into something else?
Jen, sometimes you go into a shoot with the best plans.
Oh, I know. I know. The best laid plans.
Yeah. But they don't always exactly work out.
No.
But I would say for this case, the fact that it didn't work out actually led me to the story that we're telling here. And another thing that didn't make the documentary was that while we were filming, South Africa was actually negotiating this new framework trade agreement with China. And we were also speaking to South African exporters who were excited about this new zero tariff treatment policy for all African nations that China has diplomatic ties with. But they also did remind us that tariffs are only one part of the equation. While they are keen to enter the Chinese market, standards, regulations, logistics still matter. So what all that told me was that this relationship between China, South Africa, its people, its businesses, investments, is becoming much more sophisticated than simply buying and selling goods or trade. And, I boarded the plane thinking I was going to report on a story about China's investment in Africa, but I came home feeling that I've actually reported on a story that's really about people adapting to change. And China is changing, South Africa is changing, and both sides are shaping each other in ways that are much more personal than what I expected or could have ever imagined from just reading the news or the headlines. And when people ask me, like you asked what surprised me the most, I think it's that the story wasn't really about infrastructure, but it's about peoples whose lives now span both countries and the bridges that are being built in that figurative sense. And that was a different story that I'm very happy I got to tell.
Yeah, I'm glad, and I'm sure all these the people that you met and the stories you tell would stay with you for a very long time on this unexpected discovery from what you first set out to do. Olivia, thanks very much for taking us on that journey.
Thank you, Jen.
For years, China's story in Africa was measured in kilometers of railway laid or billions of dollars invested. This documentary suggests that the next chapter may be measured differently. In factories opened, careers built, and families such as Liu Nanfei's, whose lives now span both countries and, can I say, 2 continents. Perhaps that's the clearest sign yet that this relationship is no longer moving in just one direction. Thanks for joining me on this episode of the CNA Correspondent podcast. It's brought to you by Tiffany Yang, Nefetavero, Craig Dale, Sikri Ayman, and me, Genevieve Wu. Bye for now.